the order of proceedings. Himanshu first, is it?
I'm last, so I'm safe.
You're last.
Yeah, sure. That is the first. Okay. Good evening to all of you, and thank you for gracing this occasion. May I request all of you to please put your phones on silent? Thank you.
There's no clock here.
No.
So I would like to welcome you to the inaugural session of a series that we are having on shared cultural heritage across the Indian Ocean. And in fact, today we will be under that series. This is our inaugural session. We will be covering the theme of Indianization debate, historical connections between South and Southeast Asia. Let me just recall that, in fact, what we are doing today has a certain history. Some years ago, I think it was 2015, if I'm not mistaken, when I was chairman of Research and Information System for Developing Countries. At that time, with the support of Ministry of External Affairs, we did a very important conference on India and Southeast Asia cultural civilizational links. And we had a number of fairly, distinguished scholars, not only from the region, but even from some Western countries and Japan, who were renowned, very well-known experts in the subject. And the outcome was really, in a sense, our objective had been that there was a long history of interaction amongst countries of Asia. It was a very interconnected Asia. It was Asia which had a lot of interactions, whether it was trade or whether it was, cultural links, religious links, across the board. And therefore, a certain kind of a, cultural affinity had developed over a period of time. And really, there was an interruption of this when colonialism and imperialism came. So the connections which were there amongst Asian countries, in a sense, were replaced by, colonies and metropolitan countries. I mean, that became the more important connection. And in a sense, we are now trying to rediscover those Asian connections. And I think for India, this is a particularly important and I would say very critical exercise because, throughout this history, actually, if you see, India was right at the crossroads of those linkages. Whether these were linkages through maritime contact, ruled by the monsoons, the southwest monsoon, the southeast monsoon. That is how the shipping used to take place, between peninsular India and both on the eastern reaches of the Indian Ocean and the western reaches of the Indian Ocean. But India was also at the crossroads of the old caravan routes. So if you look at the caravan routes from Central Asia, again India you find is at the intersecting point. So this developed what I consider a very, very cosmopolitan culture, very plural culture in this country, and a culture which both absorbed but also radiated, in a sense, from India. And I think it is from that message which came out from that conference that we have actually since then looked at these many connections. So Himanshu also helped us, look at, for example, the whole concept of Pan-Asianism, which developed, the early part of the 19th century, and how that led to a certain revival. Of course, it was the medium was Buddhism, but it actually had a very major impact on countries in Asia. That was the first time that, again, Asian countries started thinking of themselves as Asia again. So this is a continuing process, and I'm extremely happy, and I would like to congratulate Himanshu for really keeping this exercise going. I do not see this as a one-off event. I see this as part of a longer process, and I hope that we will do this in much deeper, with a much deeper sort of, in a sense, exploration than we have been able to do so far. Let me introduce my very distinguished panelists. Of course, Himanshu, Professor Himanshu Prabha Ray, Honorary Professor, Distant Worlds, Munich Graduate School of Ancient Studies, Ludwig Maximilian University, Munich, Member Board of Governors, Oxford Center of Hindu Studies. She's been a former chairman of the National Monuments Authority, Ministry of Culture, and former professor, Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. There is a long list, so I will, it's in any case in the brochure that you would have. But she has done a lot of work on particularly maritime history, the connections, the trade connections, the shipping links between India and the Asian countries, particularly the Indian Ocean area. We have Professor Madhavan Palat, who is a trustee of the Jawaharlal Nehru Memorial Fund and has most recently served as editor for several volumes of the selected work of Jawaharlal Nehru, published by the Oxford University Press. From 1974 until his retirement in 2004, he was professor at the Center for Historical Studies in the School of Social Sciences at Jawaharlal Nehru University, focusing on modern Russian and European history. In 2006, he was visiting professor of Imperial Russian history at the University of Chicago. He holds a DPhil from St. Anthony's College, University of Oxford. Welcome to Professor Palat. Ambassador T.C.A. Raghavan, my friend and colleague from the Foreign Service, but perhaps has earned greater laurels as a latter-day historian. And he has, of course, served as our High Commissioner in Singapore as well as in Pakistan, importantly. And after his retirement, he was Director General of the Indian Council for World Affairs. This is from 2018 to 2021. He was awarded a PhD by the Jawaharlal Nehru University in 1992 for his dissertation relating to the economic history of India. His current interests are historical research, strategic analysis, diplomatic and intellectual history of modern India. He is the author of One Attended Lords, Bairam Khan and Abdur Rahim, Courtiers and Poets of Mughal India, and which was awarded by the Muhammad Habib Memorial Prize by the Indian History of Congress in December 2017. He has also written, what else? People Next Door, drawing upon his very rich experience in Pakistan. The People Next Door, The Curious History of India's Relations with Pakistan. The curious nature of the relationship continues. And his latest book is entitled History Men. This is on Jadunath Sarkar, J.S. Sardesai, Raghubir Singh, and their quest for India's past. Another, I'm sure, very, very engaging publication. So these are our distinguished panelists, and without further ado, I will request Professor Himanshu Prabha Ray to please make her presentation. And would you like us to go there, or would you first speak?
No, I think
okay.
with the slides.
So maybe we can just shift.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor to be speaking in this distinguished panel. I'm very thankful to the President IIC, Ambassador Shyam Saran, for hosting the IIC for hosting both this panel discussion and also the workshop, which will continue for the next 2 days. I'm also grateful that we have this space today to discuss what is very close to my heart. I've been researching maritime history, also much more maritime heritage, which I will talk about today. And my focus today is not so much ancient history, but since I'm in the midst of modern historians, I'm going to move away from my ancient discipline, my discipline of ancient history and archaeology, and talk about the relevance of maritime history, maritime heritage to us today. So it's really, what do we make of this? I mean, we know about Indianization, we know about 19th and 20th century writings, but where are we now? Is it relevant today? Should we go over it, or should we just move forward and forget about the past? So let me start with my slides, and let me start with some of the very important early 20th century writers on maritime history. There are many, but I have just chosen 3, primarily because of the different themes on which they wrote. Radha Kumud Mukherjee, he wrote on Indian shipping, which was quite unusual at that time, and is quite unusual to date. I mean, his work, one can debate it, argue against it, talk from another perspective, but we still, I think, have to come up with a new work on Indian shipping, and I'm still waiting for the younger generation to move forward on that. The second one, Nilakanta Shastri, whose book again was written in 1935, so it's pre-independence, on the Cholas. It continues to be influential, to be studied, to form a text in most of our history courses. And the third person, Ambassador Raghavan, when he was in ICWA, he held a seminar on K.M. Panikkar. And what we debated was Panikkar's importance in the contemporary world. Panikkar, of course, wrote on India and the Indian Ocean, and he wrote on the influence of sea power in Indian history. But something which I think I can quote from K.M. Panikkar, and which I really like, he said that the history of India is written with the emphasis being on the north, being on Delhi and the Ganga Valley. And the rest of India somehow is an extension of the north. And sad to say, as a teacher and as a researcher, things have changed very little. So I think there's a lot to do, and a lot of work remains to be researched and to be written about. So what were these people who wrote in the pre-independence period? What was their objective, and why have we forgotten them, and why have we not followed up with what they initiated? So I would say that one of the defining features of the writing of history, which was also public history rather than the academic history which we teach and study in our universities today, was to define India's place in Asia. And this was not just something that was happening in India, but it was something which had a much larger focus. And Ambassador Shyam Saran referred to this Indo-Japan conference that we did here in IIC, where there was a discussion on Okakura Kakutsu and various other thinkers of the early 20th century, who were in dialogue with each other and had differences, but were looking for a universal history, were looking for defining India's place in the world. So there was certainly a disruption in the colonial period, but I would say what happened after independence, and have we followed up with these writings? If we haven't, where have we gone? And what is the legacy that we have carried forward from these thinkers and leaders and intellectuals who created this cultural solidarity in Asia in the early 20th century? And I think rather than go to history writing, I would go to another major landmark, which is the formation of UNESCO post the Second World War. And the fact that UNESCO's objective, as you see on the slide, is that since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds, men/women, that the defenses of peace must be constructed. So there was a shift. There was an overall emphasis that post 1945, we need to look at each other. We need to look at each other's past differently from what has been done. And a second shift to look at monuments, to look at heritage. Not just look at documents, archives, but to look at cultural heritage and how this is to be defined. And it was in this context that UNESCO's 1972 World Heritage Convention is very important. Many countries have signed it. Today, almost 194 countries have ratified UNESCO's World Heritage Convention, and India signed it in 1977. And to my mind, this is something which connects the nation state, universal history, which is world heritage, which has relevance beyond the country. It also connects, if I may say dare to say in the presence of two ambassadors, diplomacy. And the way in which world heritage could be used for promoting a national agenda, but also participating in a global agenda of a universal history and a universal perspective. So let me just very briefly go very quickly over the fact that the World Heritage Convention is administered by a World Heritage Committee. My reason for saying this is that India has been a prominent player in the World Heritage Committee. This is our third or fourth time that we are members of this World Heritage Committee. We hold the committee membership from 21 and will continue till 25, so there's still time. It's not like it's all over. There is time, and that's the reason why I'm raising it. Should we wish to do something, we perhaps can act on it. And what is the agenda that I'm promoting? I'm saying, has maritime cultural heritage found a space in this policy? Have we promoted maritime cultural heritage or not? And my short answer to that would be no. And my long answer, which I'm continuing, is what is maritime cultural heritage and why it is important? So first, culture and world heritage and cultural diplomacy. If you see the amount of money other countries spend on promoting, on conserving monuments, this is a good example, which is the US Ambassadors Fund. This restored the 16th century Varun Dev temple in Pakistan on Manora Island near Karachi. And so that the US certainly is a big spender and a big promoter, both outside India, but also within India. This is a photograph, a very old photograph, 1902-3, of the Qutb Shahi tombs, which is being restored by the Aga Khan Trust. The ASI, the Archaeological Survey, is supporting it, but there's also money which comes from the US Ambassadors Fund. So the point then is there's a major role that can be played, that can be used to push the agenda of a country towards maritime connectivity and towards tying up with our neighbors across the ocean. Has India done that? I've already said no. We have one transnational project which we have concluded, and that also has nothing to do with maritime heritage. It has to do with Corbusier and his properties in India. So be that as it may, I don't want to argue on that. But let me say that is there another way of looking at our monuments? Or is the only way forward of admiring them for art, architecture, and aesthetics? Can we connect them across the ocean with other monuments? Can we have them speak differently? So let me look at Mahabalipuram, which I'm sure all of you know. It's a World Heritage Site. It's 8th century. It's a coastal site, so it's right on the coast, as you can see from this PowerPoint. If it's on the coast, does it orient itself to the ocean, or does it orient itself inland towards Delhi? And unfortunately, we look at it as a monument built by a political dynasty, which is all very fine. But what we don't look at is what is its maritime orientation, and that's something that I would like to draw your attention to. The first point is it did not come up in isolation. It's part of a very long occupation of the coast, starting from the Iron Age, early brick temples, and so on. It is also a part, or it projects the narrative of various deities associated with the sea. It also is very important as being located on an island. So clearly, there are many layers or many facets to looking at a monument which is on the coast, not only in terms of its art and architecture. And the most important, I would say, is as a marker for vessels, water vessels or ships coming from the ocean. If you recall, in the pre-modern period, there were no maps, there is no GPS, there is no way of knowing where landfall is. And how do ships coming towards the coast, how do they orient themselves? They orient themselves by the monuments on the coast. And what is quite interesting is that the Indian coast, if you go around it, many of the lighthouses which the British built, and Mahabalipuram is a good example, are very close to older temples or older sites. So in terms of the space, there is continuity of the use of coastal monuments as markers for sea vessels coming in. This, of course, is an Iron Age burial site. It's very close to Mahabalipuram. It has been excavated by the Archaeological Survey of India. The reason why I raise it is not just to show you the continuity of occupation of the coast, but to also say that since we do not pay attention to our coastal monuments, they are being destroyed. And these Iron Age sites are the worst sufferers because nobody claims them. You know, they were not built by a grand dynasty, so nobody cares. And Kanchipuram, around Kanchipuram, the temple site of Kanchipuram, there were many such monuments which no longer exist. The Salvankuppam, which is 6 kilometers north of Mahabalipuram on the right-hand side, that's a temple which emerged after the tsunami, and then the excavations were done, and that's an earlier temple before the Mahabalipuram temple. And the other point that I made was the narratives associated with the ocean, which are very prominent at most of our temples. So what is the problem then? I would argue the problem is that since we do not engage with maritime heritage, since we do not largely engage with maritime history of the ancient period, we do not even legislate for coastal monuments. So coastal monuments do not count as a category. They come under unprotected heritage. The other categories, of course, are centrally protected, which are the more important ones. State protected, some of them, states don't have money, so they don't go very far. The union territories, yes. Then there are temple trusts. There's urban heritage, world heritage, so on and so forth. But most of the coastal heritage is unprotected. So my question to you is, can we protect it if we don't even recognize it as a category? And the picture is there in front of you. That's a Chola period, 10th, 11th century so-called lighthouse, which is near a wildlife sanctuary. So the wildlife sanctuary is protected, but not our monument. I've only talked about temples and lighthouses, but I could go on and on all evening talking about the diversity. Kerala, you can, coastal monuments, you can start from Iron Age burial sites to monasteries, temples, churches, forts, cemeteries, so on and so forth. It's all there for you to, on the map. Some of these are protected, not all of them. And the ones that are not protected are really in a sad way. Now, to show you the difference, this is Tarangambadi or Trankabar. On the left is the temple, which is in worship, not protected. On the right is the Danish fort. The Danish fort also gets a lot of money from the Europeans, and you can see that it's, it's nicely restored. There's a larger history to that. It's also part of a fishing village. These were the people who suffered a great deal under tsunami. Most of their huts were wiped away. But the difference then is in trying to legislate, trying to protect sites, trying to recognize our coastal heritage, if we are to keep it for posterity. Otherwise, there's only a few things that will survive, the ones that achieve World Heritage status and make it to the UNESCO list. So finally, I would reiterate that if we are to take our maritime cultural heritage forward, if we are to preserve it, if we are to bequeath it to posterity, to the future, I think the basic thrust, the basic attempt is understanding maritime history, relations, maritime connectivity, and to really focus, shift the focus from the Ganga Valley, from north of India to peninsular India. I mean, it's extraordinary. We have such a huge coastline, and we seem to never think that we ever ventured across. We sort of just stayed there and tilled our little fields. Never mind that, but I think we need to move forward, do some research, but also rethink our policy of using World Heritage for promoting a wider vision of the relations that India had in the pre-modern world. Thank you.
How many minutes do we have?
15, I thought I did all right.
Okay.
Yeah.
15.
You're keeping this here?
Yeah, no, I don't know how to switch this on.
That's really good. Okay, I'll hold the paper in my hand.
No, I mean, yeah. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Professor Palat, you don't have any slides?
Nothing.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Himanshu. A bit of a depressing story, I think. I hadn't realized that there was no legislation protecting, maritime heritage. I think that certainly requires some effort. Because, as you said, not only in terms of preserving what is very valuable heritage, but also in terms of the diplomacy that you spoke about, it's certainly something that we should be focusing attention on. May I now turn to Professor Madhavan Palat, who will be talking about Indian nationalist readings of Southeast Asian history. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Chairman and friends. Indian nationalist readings, I'm afraid I have concentrated on NEHRU specifically as the nationalist who will represent all the other nationalists. And I think that's a fairly reasonable choice, since that NEHRU has written a substantial amount. He represents nationalism in a way that very few can dispute. And the importance of him I need hardly exaggerate. So it's worth perhaps analyzing in some detail how he approached the history of Southeast Asia. One of the refreshing things about NEHRU's books is that he has actually devoted a lot of attention to Southeast Asia, something which we never study in our universities. We never know anything about it. We concentrate, as Himanshu rightly said, on the Ganga Valley. We do not even get into the peninsula, leave alone getting beyond to the transoceanic world of Southeast Asia. So NEHRU did it obviously as a correction to all that, and that is refreshing. But you can see how difficult it is, all that Himanshu said about how we, our difficulties about approaching maritime history and about our world beyond the oceans, how difficult it is when even NEHRU came up short. And that's what I'm going to talk about. the difficulties he had, as far as I can see, about capturing that relationship in a manner that was what we would now consider satisfactory, without an excess of nationalism and even chauvinism. There's a bit of difficulty there. Nehru's account of Southeast Asia is the exception to the rest of his account of Indian history, Indian nationalist history, and world history. And that is why it is of special importance, I think, to have a look at it. He accorded special importance to Southeast Asia, and at the same time, he almost ignored Central Asia. Now, this is rather unusual. We are so used to thinking of Central Asia as the continental area with which we are intimately connected. And that is how all our histories have been written all the time. But Nehru almost completely ignored it, except for Mahmud of Ghazni and his raids. What happened to everything else in Central Asia, he does not talk about, practically. But on Central Asia, he has many chapters and a lot of detail, which obviously he intended as a correction to the nature of colonial historiography, which focused entirely on the subcontinent as an isolated monument on its own. It is the object of history, subjected to numerous invasions coming from Central Asia, Indians not doing anything except being victims of it, and Indians doing nothing else beyond that, not going out of India to Southeast Asia or anywhere else in the world. So he wanted to correct that, obviously. Along with that, he had another constant target for some reason, which I find a bit, I can explain it for perhaps personal reasons. He always thought Hindu conservatism was extremely self-isolating, and it confined itself to the continent as a caricatured version of the colonial and Orientalist version of Indian culture. And he keeps on repeating the superstition against the Kala Pani and the going across the oceans and across the seas. And once again, to correct that, he showed that Indians actually used to go very regularly and very far. So he refuted both these by showing how India actually had expanded into the wide world, of which Southeast Asia took the major part, in the manner that Europe itself had. And Russia had into the steppe, China into the steppe, and the Arabs into the African, Mediterranean, and Arabian Sea littorals. So India was one of that group of peoples, as it were, which went outward, far from being focused inside only. And in all his speeches, he stresses this point, that India took its culture from Mongolia to the Philippines and everything in between. And obviously, Southeast Asia and the mainland of Asia in the southeast came into it. And he gives a lot of evidence of the kind of transfer of Indian place names, like Ayodhya, Hastinapur, Gandhara, Cambodia, Yavadvipa, which becomes Java, and so on. And the literary and numismatic evidence about India as a seafaring nation, showing coins with ships as a device, about which Himanshu will tell us much more during the seminar, I'm sure we'll hear. Now, so how does he present the story? It is as the history of three main empires, that is Cambodia, Sri Vijaya, and Majapahit. And it is about the period from roughly the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era until the 16th. So you have roughly 14 to 15 centuries that he covers, where Indians colonized, set up empires, conducted trade, spread their religions, and spread Indian culture. Please note, it's Indian culture that they spread out into those areas in a big way. And at the end of it, you get the feeling that India almost created Southeast Asia. There was no Southeast Asia before that. Who were living there before, we do not know. Seems to be only Indians, from Nehru's account. And Chinese and others just about get a look in, almost as marginal players. So it's all India and more of India, for over 14 to 15 centuries, in a way that does credit to any colonial historian about the way they transformed the Orient into a caricature of Europe. And within this, it is Hinduism which takes a sort of priority, which is rather surprising from Nehru. That's not what you'd expect. But he waxes eloquent about Hinduism for about 500 years in the initial phase, and then goes on to Buddhism. And after Buddhism subsides and Islam begins to overwhelm it, Islam itself is overwhelmed by the European colonial conquests. So it is Hinduism and Buddhism, with Hinduism taking a certain lead amongst it all. And even interestingly, in the initial, that is the glimpses of world history, he writes almost like a Dravidian nationalist. It's all about the Pallavas and the Cholas doing everything. At least when he comes round to the discovery later, 10 years later, a little better. Other Indians also participated. People from the center, like in Malwa and so on, and he does say that Orissa played a very major role in the creation of the Shailendra Empire. So the great stories he has, as I said, are the Cambodian Empire, the Sri Vijayan one. Sri Vijayan is in Vijaya is in Sumatra based, but very widespread, extending even up to Sri Lanka, and the Majapahit in Java. It's all about colonization, trading, religion, architecture, art, all of Nehru's favorite themes except for empire. But here he discusses a lot about empire. And I said, it sounds very Indian nationalist with a Hindu accent to it. Most unusual from a man like Nehru. It is the complacency and the tone deafness of it that is rather surprising. Coming from a man like Nehru, when the rest of his work is that of a critical nationalist and of a skeptical nationalist, here he is not that kind at all. It's the exceptional story. Now, it's not because he is short of books to read. He's read all the books. Quite an impressive number between R.C. Majumdar and B.R. Chatterjee and Ghoshal and the Orientalists like Charles Eliot and Quaritch Wales, the Rice Davids, René Grousset, he read a lot of, and of course all Cambridge modern history, the Cambridge history of India, sorry. His great hero is the Shailendra dynasty. That's a great empire builder, which he traced to Orissa of the origin. So he allowed that to Orissa. And placing an Indian expansion, presenting the story as a sort of Indian expansion, as part of like the worldwide European expansion, he seems to have been ready to face the odium of any Southeast Asian nationalist. How will they react to an Indian, especially a man like Nehru, a great nationalist, decolonizing leader and inspiring figure like him, presenting it in this way? But he chose this particular line of argument or presentation, partly by the close relationship with the Greater India Society, about which you're going to hear in a short while, and perhaps as it being the optimal rather than the best. At least it will garner some support within India, I suppose. Now, what was the Indian image that he expected would result from this in the Southeast Asia? And how did he respond to their, or what did he think about their possible responses to it? He complained that in Southeast Asia there is a narrow nationalism which has seized them. Now, what did he mean by a narrow nationalism? He himself has not written anything after the 16th century about Southeast Asia, only up to the 16th century. There's a passing mention of the young Filipinos, that's all. Otherwise, nothing of their nationalism, only about imperialist rivalries. So what does he think that, how did he think that they would respond to him? His complaint is that they were narrow nationalists, by which he meant that India was no longer regarded with the affection that it should be and would have been, given that it had 14 to 15 centuries of a presence there and such a creative presence there. India doesn't enjoy the affection that he expected it should enjoy. Well, why should it, is the point. But he expected it to. And he even said India did not enjoy the affection that was due to the, in quotations, mother country. He used as colonial an expression as that. I'm surprised that he did so. Now, he did caution against narrow nationalism in India. That is one of his running themes whenever he was a critic of nationalism. But because he didn't want nationalism to turn inward. He was always worried about any of our ideologies turning inward. He wanted us to always to turn outward, to be global constantly, like he himself. And here he was one with Gandhi and Tagore in their different ways, and they had their debates about it. But the main worry about all of them is that it should not turn inward. So when he says Southeast Asia, there were narrow nationalists, what does he mean? It is not that they were turning inward, it's that they were rejecting India or not paying enough attention to India. They were turning westward. This was his grievance. And he said, how can they possibly do it, given that India is a mother country? And it sounds almost a bit peevish, the way he put it, that they did not have enough, he didn't use the word gratitude, but something close to it. And here he was happy to quote, when he got the chance, a Thai visitor to Shantiniketan, who actually called India in a very effusive and ecstatic terms, the grand motherland. Now, from motherland you become grandmotherland. It no doubt makes us very happy to hear that. But he did finally retrieve the situation in some way by comparing India to Greece. Just as Greece gave her exquisite culture and so creative a culture to the whole of Europe, and Europe is eternally beholden to it, although Greece is now a completely isolated backwater in modern Europe. India similarly gave its culture to Southeast Asia. So India and Greece, Europe and Southeast Asia and Europe. That's where the analogies come. But while Greece has become just a dump in the corner of Europe, India is now once again the leader of the decolonization, non-alignment, and all the good things like Panchsheel and so on. So India can once again be the leader that it once had been. This is how he sees the future coming about, but from a rather unfortunate representation of Indian position in Southeast Asia. He also comes out in some sense as a Hindu nationalist, which is most peculiar in a person like him. You see, he examined the history only until the 16th century when Hinduism and then Buddhism were dominant, and after that he did not take any more interest. So why was this? And it seems there's too much of a interest in Hinduism in a way that he would not have done even with Indian history. And that is more, you can see that aspect of it when you compare it with the manner in which he treats Central Asia. As I said at the beginning, he has not touched upon Central Asia, almost, in his great glimpses of world history and obviously of Indian history, the discovery. In the discovery, Southeast Asia has a major role to play. That's the discovery of India, please. But not Central Asia. That has no role. Now, it is a region with so many influences, Indian into Central Asia and vice versa. So why isn't he not talking about it? One reason to a nationalist, and you must remember always the conventional Indian nationalist and colonial histories that come to us. It is always that India is being invaded from Central Asia. So the invaders come from Central Asia. India is the object. India is the victim. It is always that vision that informs you. It's always the movement is one way. India doesn't seem to be going the other way into Central Asia. That's how we always get the story. Whereas Southeast Asia, the picture is much nicer, much better, more inspiring. It's the Indians who are going there, not they who are coming here. So obviously the story is better to a nationalist mind to be told. And he seems to satisfy that particular requirement. Of course, the objections could be, well, who says only the Central Asians are coming into India? There are so many other kinds of contacts. The Kushan Empire, for example, was Central Asian plus Indian, and Afghanistan was half the time, or more than half the time, part of various Indian empires. Besides, you can go into mythology and think of an important princess like Gandhari, or a rather malign minister called Shakuni, and you know what he did. Yeah, but it's all part of Indian culture, and why should one assume that that is not there? But what he had in mind is he was answering a playing with a particular objection that people always have, that all the rulers in India who come from Central Asia see themselves as originating in Central Asia. And he had to make a special critical point that even if they originated somewhere else, they're all Indian because they lived in India, they created Indian empires, and the only one that ruled from abroad were the British. Otherwise, India was always independent. So the origin does not matter. And here he has a point. All warrior aristocracies throughout history, in any part of the world, always claim an origin outside the country that they're ruling, because you rule by right of conquest. That is what legitimizes a warrior aristocracy's rule. Only a democrat and a nationalist wants to be part of the nation that they're ruling. Before that, they always wish to be superior to that world, to that nation, and therefore they came from somewhere abroad. Every legend is that I came from abroad, from somewhere else. I mean, you can trace it to practically any history you wish. You'll find that. And so, Central Asia, therefore, to the nationalist Indian mind, doesn't seem to be the right subject, whereas Southeast Asia seems to be satisfactory. And he seems to have fitted in his histories and the balance of accounts in his histories in this particular fashion. In two other respects, he's rather different from all his other work. Here he glorifies military history and military achievement. Nehru in his other histories does not glorify military histories and military achievement in any way. He dislikes it, in fact. None of the great Indian kings and emperors and warriors does he glorify. Poor Rana Pratap gets just one sentence, and Shivaji also, our great heroes. All the others are passed over. As cultural leaders, yes, but not as great warriors. So he passes over all the emperors, one after the other. In his world histories, Alexander and Caesar, he considers puny men. He's quite contemptuous of them. But that's perhaps because there was such an over-glorification of them by the old European historiography. He must have got a bit fed up reading about it. But there are two exceptions he makes for world history. That's Genghis Khan and Napoleon, strangely. Genghis Khan he actually is quite positive about. And he himself remarks, I'm surprised I'm so positive about Genghis Khan. He writes that to his daughter. But he can't help himself. And he said, compared to Genghis Khan, there's Alexander and Caesar and so on are completely minuscule figures. And the other one is Napoleon, strangely, again. 3 full chapters of the glimpses are devoted to Napoleon. Although Napoleon was a person who made war all the time and reduced Europe and reduced France especially and drained her of able-bodied young men completely and so on, but still he played up Napoleon. I can see there is an anti-British nationalism there which comes into play. But when it came to Southeast Asia, he need not have. I would have thought he would have written about it in the way he wrote his Indian histories. No, but Shailendra becomes the great hero. He's the great warrior king. And he devotes to him that kind of attention which he might have expected he would have done for Samudragupta or somebody like that. But no, it is Shailendra he reserves all that for. He's a warrior king. And he speaks of him as an empire builder, not for the culture that he created, but as a military hero, which is, again, exceptional in everything that Nehru writes. And one more aspect is his attitude to Buddhism. Now, when he wrote about Buddhism in India, it is always about Buddhism. The Buddhism that he favored was the ethical system, what Buddha himself preached. He tried to get as close as possible to that, not to the organized religion that we understand as Mahayana, which it's with its hierarchy of priests, its doctrines and deities and so on, all the things that he despised about religion, he didn't like about Mahayana. And even when it came to Harsha, whom he wrote favorably about, but he thought his Buddhism, because it was Mahayana Buddhism, was not the best thing. So Nehru was clear. Buddhism is an ethical set of values which is worth pursuing even in the modern world. It was immensely fruitful in the ancient world. And he said as Buddhism receded from India, it left behind a wonderful heritage which has been absorbed by Hinduism also. That is its ethics. That is the important part. But when it comes to Central Asia, to Southeast Asia, the Buddhism that he talks about is the organized religion. There's almost no mention about the ethics of it that he talked about so much in India. It is the organized religion, and he equated religion with culture. Another heresy on his part. He would never have dreamt of doing that in India, about Indian history. Religion is not culture. They're two different things. And religion was something he wanted to keep on the side. That is the organized structure of it, with its dogma and priestly hierarchy. But here, Buddhism was treated as a religion and equated to culture in a way that he may not have done otherwise. So Nehru appears in a rather unusual light, an exceptional light, the non-Nehru, as it were, when it comes to Southeast Asia. Not only as a nationalist, but sometimes I felt a bit of a chauvinist, and with an emphasis on Hinduism, which we would not expect from him. Now, how he has been read in these countries, I would be interested to know, given this, if anybody bothered to read it and analyze it, that is, and what its implications were when he stood forth as a leader of decolonization, of non-alignment, and Panchil, Bandung, all these things, how it actually impacted all these initiatives of his, where did it stand, especially given the gap in his histories about the colonial phase of Southeast Asian history and their nationalism, which should have been the analogue of Indian nationalism, about which he doesn't say anything at all. Thank you very much.
I think you will all agree that this has been a master class exposing a side of Nehru that I had not suspected had existed. Thank you very much. Just goes to show how complex a character he was. And like all complex characters, also someone so full of contradictions in a sense.
Absolutely.
But also, I wanted to just mention to you that he ended up having as national symbols something drawn from Ashoka.
Yes, yes.
And
Buddhism was a civic religion, almost.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Now, my friend Raghavan will be
Thank
talking
you. Thank
to
you
us.
very much, sir. Thank you, Ambassador Shyam Saran, for hosting this workshop, and thank you, Professor Ray, for inviting me to it and to talk today about the Greater India Society, and also a little bit about how it interfaced and continues to interface with our diplomacy today, or does not. Now, the Greater India Society is important because it was the first and possibly only concerted effort by a fraternal group of scholars to study non-Indian history. Something like it has never happened since, although my old teacher, Professor Madhavan Palat, tried very hard to inject a sense of European history into all of us, but his was a solitary effort which remains to be duplicated. But the Greater India Society, which was a group of historians, epigraphists, historians of art and architecture, coming together for a period of years to work on non-Indian history, was something different. It was new in India, and as I said, it's not happened since. It is usually seen, since in the years past, as a intellectual defense mounted by colonial intellectuals to reinvent a kind of imperial past for India too. It was a natural response to the fact that we were a subject nation, and these were a group of highly educated, informed intellectuals, and this was a kind of reaction to that. That is one perspective with which it is viewed. The other is it is largely seen as a Hindu nationalist enterprise. And both these readings continue, and even in contemporary discussions of the Greater India Society, they certainly are present, and I'll touch on them on this later. But the Greater India Society, as Professor Ray mentioned, was founded in 1926 and is usually associated with Tagore's worldview. I mean, his internationalism, his travels to Southeast Asia, his interest and his great stature in Bengal and in India at that time in the 1920s. The general perspective is that he gathered around him this group of intellectuals who then started studying the imprint of Indian culture beyond India. So the society, it is normally said, I mean, it is generally believed, was founded in 1926, and this was a few months before Tagore embarked on a journey to Southeast Asia, and that really was the main stimulus for it. In fact, there are antecedents to this interest in non-Indian history, and I found that as early as the 1870s, Professor R.G. Bhandarkar, then a professor of history in Deccan College, Pune, presented a paper at a meeting of the Bombay branch of the Asiatic Society on a particular inscription in Sanskrit which had been found in Vietnam. And the paper was about that inscription and the technical aspects of the script and the language. It was in Sanskrit, the content of the inscription, the meter, and so on. But the larger point he also made was that this showed that there was no bar on Indians crossing the oceans and undertaking great enterprises in faraway countries. That was the general perspective from which Dr. Bhandarkar viewed this particular inscription. But later in the 1910s, in 1912 or 1913, there was this celebrated and acrimonious debate between Radhakumud Mukherjee, whose book Professor Ray showed on her slide on the history of Indian shipping, and Rakhal Das Banerjee, who later on in the archaeological survey discovered the Indus Valley civilization. Now in this book, Professor Mukherjee had a number of images from the Borobudur site, which were of ships approaching a shore and people disembarking from the ships, and he captioned them as Indian adventurers arriving in Java. And Rakhal Das Banerjee, and the caption also was the Indian colonization of Java. And Rakhal Das Banerjee then wrote a long article in the Modern Review objecting to this. He didn't object to the fact of the Hindu colonization of Java. He said, yes, there were Hindu colonies in Java. But he said that that Professor Mukherjee does not know how to understand, he doesn't know how to read evidence. And using these images is methodologically wrong, because these images are from the Jatakas and they are illustrating a religious fable. You cannot draw a secular conclusion about the establishment of a colony from this. And now this was a very acrimonious debate, because Radhakumud Mukherjee was a celebrated nationalist historian. He wrote this book very much from a nationalist perspective. He had been active in the Swadeshi movement, etc., etc. Rakhal Das Banerjee himself was a well-known historian at the time, and this extended over 7 or 8 articles and counter articles, very acrimonious, as I said. But a little later, we again have another. He was not an academic or a trained historian, but he was an interested scholar, O.C. Ganguly, and he brought out a journal called Rupam, which continued for about 10 years from 1918 to 1929, which had a number of articles on Indian art and archaeology and Indian temples, sculpture, etc., etc., but also had many articles on Southeast Asian art and the origins of Southeast Asian art in India. And in this journal, he would occasionally print articles by French or Dutch scholars which had appeared in Europe. He would get them translated and reprint them in Rupam. And in one of them, there was an article by this famous Dutch historian and archaeologist F.D.K. Bosch, with which who raised certain questions about the origins of Javanese art. And the point Bosch made was that that while art in Java has so obviously certain Indian influences, there's no historical evidence which will explain the nature of these influences, to which Upendra Kumar Ganguly objected and wrote a long rebuttal. My point is that there was a certain interest in the subjects which otherwise are generally associated as having begun with the Greater India Society. And the reason for that was that there were two important institutional changes which happened in the early 20th century. The first was the founding of the Archaeological Survey of India, the reorganization of the Archaeological Survey of India in 1904 with the passage of there was a particular act called the Antiquities Act 1904, also related to the interest which the Viceroy Lord Curzon then took. There was the establishment of the EO for Indochina, a French archaeological and historical learned society, and the founding of the Dutch Archaeological Service for the Dutch East Indies in 1914. So you have these three more or less parallel streams coming together, and there was a great deal of exchange between these three, which influenced scholars in India, also because the Calcutta University established a postgraduate department of Indian history in 1910 or 1911, largely due to the efforts of the Vice Chancellor, Professor Ashutosh Mukherjee. And in 1918, it started a Department of Ancient Indian History and Culture. And many of the students of these two departments later on became the principal members of the Greater India Society. The Greater India Society, after its founding, they brought out 4 or 5 bulletins on Java, on Southeast Asia, on Vietnam, Indochina really, on Central Asia, Afghanistan. But from 1934, they started bringing out a regular journal, biannual journal, twice a year. And this journal was brought out regularly till 1946. Thereafter, it was a long gap, and the last issue came out in 1956 or 1957. So more or less with independence, the Greater India movement the Greater India Society had really lost its momentum. The people associated with it were Kalidas Nag, he was a teacher in the history department of Calcutta University for a long time, R.C. Majumdar, of course, U.N. Ghosal, Himanshu Bhushan Sarkar, a student of R.C. Majumdar. And the general view is that this was very much an idea of Bengal historians. But actually there were others. There was Neelkanta Shastri from the south, who you referred to, again, who wrote in it and certainly was interested in the same issues. There was B.R. Chatterjee. B.R. Chatterjee, although a Bengali, was from Lahore. He taught at Meerut College most of his life, and I'll touch on him a little later. There was Bidhan Chand Chhabra from Kohat in the Northwest Frontier Province, who studied Sanskrit in Lahore, but then went on to do a PhD in Leiden on the Pallavas and the influence of Pallava art on Southeast Asia. The stated objects of the Greater India Society, it's interesting. It was Sir India, India Minor, Indochina, Insular India, which meant Afghanistan, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia, broadly. But if you see the content of its art of the journal from 1934 to 1946, and thereafter the 2 or 3 issues which came out in the mid-1950s, almost 60 to 70% is about Southeast Asia. And possibly Nehru's focus also on Southeast Asia is because this is the literature which he read, and from the books he used to get when he was in jail, we know he used to ask for R.C. Majumdar, Neelkanta Shastri, B.R. Chatterjee, because they were all writing and publishing a great deal about India's cultural contacts with Southeast Asia. Now, what happened to this scholarship? What explains this somewhat abrupt end from the late 40s? Now, many of the scholars who were associated with it did reflect on this. And Himanshu Bhushan Sarkar, who was writing well into the 80s, for instance, wrote that it was a natural consequence of the decolonization of India. That the Greater India Society emerged in colonial conditions, and with the end of the colonial situation, it came to an end. So it was a direct relationship between the colonial context and this particular enterprise. But others, for instance, B.R. Chatterjee, had an interesting afterlife which I discovered, because after he retired from Meerut College, as principal of Meerut College, he joined the ICWA, the newly founded ICWA in 1948. The ICWA was founded with the mission of deepening research and discussion of foreign policy for a newly independent country. And soon the ICWA had another institution established within it, which was the School of International Studies. And B.R. Chatterjee, a historian, was asked to head the Southeast Asia department of the School of International Studies in the ICWA. At this time, he reflected on his earlier writings as part of this Greater India Society, and at one time wrote, he brought out a book called which he now titled History of Indonesia, Early and Medieval. Now, this was substantially the same book as he had brought out in the early 1930s, called India and Java. But he changed the title, and he explains why he changed the title. India and Java and Greater India smack too much of Indian self-glorification. Such is the Indonesian sentiment nowadays. I have learned this from direct contact with educated Indonesians in Java and elsewhere. Again, in this small book, not only Java, but also Sumatra, Bali, and occasionally Borneo figure prominently. Therefore, to single out Java would again be offending Indonesian feelings, which are very sensitive on this point. Then he goes on elsewhere to say, I too, when I was working in the Indian School of International Studies in Delhi, heard from Indonesian friends objections, within brackets, mildly expressed, for they were very friendly to us, brackets closed, to the term Greater India. I agree that Greater India also implies political domination. In Southeast Asia, Indian influence was purely cultural. There was no political link whatsoever. It is really a unique case. The only other instances are, I think, Greek cultural conquest of Rome after Rome had conquered Greece, Persian cultural influence on the Arab world after Persia had fallen to Arab arms, maybe another instance. You can clearly see the impact of decolonization on someone such as B.R. Chatterjee. Now, R.C. Majumdar also confronted this question somewhat unusually. Now, R.C. Majumdar is a somewhat unique case because he used to state his views very, very frontally. He didn't believe in moderating or nuancing what he was saying to make it more acceptable to the particular audience which he was addressing. Now, R.C. Majumdar, strangely enough, was invited to the Asian Relations Conference, and he presented a paper titled Cultural Problems of India and Indonesia. In the latter, in Indonesia, he included Indochina, and the term itself, the paper makes clear, he included the whole of Southeast Asia in it. Now, in this paper, he says, future relations of this region with India would have to be based, quote, on a clear comprehension of the relations that subsisted between them in the past, unquote. Majumdar said that the earliest civilization of the region was deeply influenced by India and to a large extent directly influenced from this country. India was therefore the spiritual home of most of the peoples of Indochina and Indonesia. Thus, China, because of its proximity, had political influence, yet its cultural influence in their lands was almost negligible in comparison to that of India. And the reason for this must be sought in the fact that being originally derived from India, the civilization of these countries was inherently Indian in spirit and was therefore more responsive to it. Because of this, the education of an Indian student would remain incomplete without a knowledge of the civilization of these countries and the part played by his ancestors in developing it. By the same token, students in these countries cannot hope to understand their religion, art, and literature without some knowledge of the source from which they sprang. Now, there's more on these lines, and you can find other such examples amongst the Greater India Society scholars. But I'll come very rapidly to the other part about how does the world of Indian diplomacy deal with this. That you have this body of scholarship which posits this very close cultural link, but the subtext to that is that India is the mother culture, and this question is confronted by Badruddin Taibji as ambassador to Indonesia in the early 1950s. And he wrote a number of dispatches on this question to the Ministry of External Affairs, which unfortunately remain unpublished. But in his autobiography, he touches on this matter with some candor. And he said, he was there in 1955, and by then the divergences between India and Indonesia, because of various policy differences, which are not relevant now, but those divergences had become quite evident. So he writes, there was indeed an urgent need for correcting the unfortunate twist that in recent years has been given to Indo-Indonesia relations. Some of my predecessors in office and over-enthusiastic visitors from India, like Dr. Raghuveera. Now, Dr. Raghuveera was a well-known scholar of his times. Like Dr. Raghuveera, in their nationalistic zeal, would nimbly hop, skip, and jump in their readings of Indonesian history. They would loudly expatiate only on the great period of the expansion of Indian culture and civilization in Southeast Asia, of which one of the most famous periods was that of the Shri Vijayan kingdom. There are, of course, abundant traces and splendid examples of Indian cultural influence, and so on and so forth. And he says, there's all this evidence for this culture, and the Indonesians themselves acknowledge it, and there's so much influence of Sanskrit and so on. But he then goes on to say, nevertheless, it had to be borne in mind that since then over 90% of Indonesians have been converted to Islam and had become equally proud of their Islamic heritage. Fortunately for them, much of their Islamic heritage also came to them from Indian sources. But this was very little known or deliberately ignored by the present generation of Indian scholars of Southeast Asian history, which is very true. Because, you see, if you see the Greater India Society, there are two noticeable gaps in the thrust of its scholarship. The first is that it is so strongly focused on Southeast Asia and not so much on Afghanistan or Central Asia. Now, part of this could be because Southeast Asia was relatively open in terms of the scholarship available which they could read. I mean, it was a difficult enterprise for them to learn Dutch and learn French and then read the original sources, because the archaeologists of the colonial metropolis was really working in these countries. Perhaps no such sources were available for for Central Asia. It was from the 20s, 30s, 40s. Perhaps it was more of a closed space than Southeast Asia was. But anyway, that is one gap. that why do they study Southeast Asia so much and not Central Asia and Afghanistan? And the second obvious gap is that they all stop at the beginning of the quote-unquote Islamic period. R.C. Majumdar, Himanshu Bhushan Chatterjee, Himanshu Bhushan Sarkar, B.R. Chatterjee, Nilkanta Shastri, they all mention that Islam traveled to Southeast Asia in much the same way as Hinduism and Buddhism had. But they don't ever explore that point. It's just stated, but left to that, and the rest of the book is a kind of elegy to the collapse of these great Buddhist and Hindu kingdoms. And now I wondered, why was there this gap about not studying the fact that Islam traveled to most of Southeast Asia from the western coast. And possibly it could be because that they were ancient historians. They knew Sanskrit, they had studied epigraphy of ancient India, and they were not really medievalists. And perhaps they may explain that gap. Should I wind up, sir? Have I?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So I had some other points, but perhaps we'll touch on them in the question answer. Thank you very much again for inviting me. As I said, this interface between diplomacy and the Greater India Society is an issue we are confronted with still struggling to find answers to. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Raghavan. Extremely interesting account of this great Indian society. Just to say that having served in Indonesia, in Burma, in Nepal as well, mainly Asian countries, I can testify to the fact that there is great deal of allergy to visitors from India claiming that all their culture has come from India. With regard to Central Asia, I just want to make 2 points. One is there was a huge amount of scholarship on Central Asia and Indian influence in Central Asia by people like Order Stein.
Yes.
If you read, for example, Serindia, you see massive amount of documentation, and you know the Tunhuang, not only the art but as well as the huge amount of Sanskrit texts which were discovered there. I'm surprised that there has been very little interest in that, because it's a very rich source in a sense of our own history. And just to also illustrate the point about Indians going to Central Asia as well, in the Tang dynasty, the Tang capital, Xi'an, was one of the most cosmopolitan cities anywhere in the world, and had a Indian community, a Persian community. You had the Sogdians from the region, and it is mentioned there that one of the most popular songs in the Tang capital was the love song of the river Ganges. So obviously something must have traveled all the way to Xi'an from India, and they were obviously aware of at least there being a river Ganges in India. We have about 10 minutes left to us, and I'm sure that there may be some questions from our audience. So please tell us who you are, and if you have a question, please let us know whether there is any particular panelist you want to address the question to. Please raise your hand, anyone who wants to ask a question. Yes, please.
Thank you. My question has to do with your definition of the role of the Indian independence movement and independence as such in the interpretation of the relations between India and Southeast Asia. Actually, if you read the late 19th century, early 20th century European sources, you find that there is no clear definition of colonialism, but rather the Greater India, which is a whole, where there is no distinct superiority always from what we call now modern India, but rather the understanding inherited from the Middle Ages, that it was all a great world of culture extending from, let's say, current-day Pakistan to all the way to Indonesia. And I think that's interesting because the concept of an Indian imperial influence perhaps came rather with the rise of Indian nationalism, whereas before that, the interpretation of Western scholars was one of a sort of unity. And France, for example, was very proud to say, we have taken part of India, we lost the western part to the British, but we are now getting the better part of India from what is now Indochina. Yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah, yes, please.
My question is with regard to the semantic issue of Indianization, Indian colonizations. Just because of the fact that we live in a world of nation states, does it mean that the Indic cultural arc that we see so prominently in from Bob Hawke to Philippines be ignored? And the very fact that when we are talking of Indianization or Indian cultural arc, we are talking of not a point of origin, but a circulatory nature, yes, which has many points, many notes. As late as 13th century in Singhasari, which I will be presenting, we have Devanagari. And Kublai Khan, and if Singhasari kings, Kritanagara was doing some rituals with regard to Heruka rites, it all suggests there are people in Tibet who are from Bengal, like for example Gautama Shri, a monk from Bengal who went to Tibet and then played a part in Kublai Khan's Heruka ceremony. And therefore, what is the problem of using this term if you see so prominently, just because of the fact that we live in this world of post-colonialism, and so far as with regard to Western Muslims' contribution.
Please ask a question.
This is with regard to issue of the role of Western coast and Islamization's post-Majapahit period. And the third question is with regard to the term Hindu. What are the references of Nehru? Which book he refers to while talking of Hindu influence in Southeast Asia, ignoring the broader Indic one.
Any other question? Okay, I think let's. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
So I just wanted to ask,
if
we
please
can
identify yourself.
Yeah, I'm Anuge, and I'm a literature student. Anyway, what I want to ask is, would it be one way of looking at this problem of Greater India? Could we look at it in the sense that German Indology, Western Indology, particularly German Indology, saw this idea of Greater India in the image of Europe's nationalisms, in the sense that there is an idea of Greater Germany that Germany worked with, which didn't quite materialize, which is something that Hitler maybe, when the Anschluss with Austria happened, maybe that was something he was trying to fulfill. The point is whether there is a certain way in which German ideology looked at India in their own image, and then Indian nationalists also adopted that idea as a nationalist idea, because philosophically, at the end of the day, nationalisms work in a similar way wherever they develop.
Okay. Yeah. So perhaps Professor Nalpathy, would you like to respond to some of those?
Is it on? Can you hear me? Yeah. About the question of Europeans speaking of unity of the whole region rather than of Indian superiority, yes and no. The point is, many of the Europeans that Nehru himself read, the Orientalists, I can specifically suggest Charles Eliot and Corrich Wales, spoke of Indian superiority in the region. They spoke almost like Indian nationalists, in a way that you'd not expect Europeans to be doing. But he did it, and he quotes them. That's why he quotes them. So the Europeans were varied in their analysis of the period, of the whole region. When it came to this area, they sometimes adopted the garb of a greater Indian themselves. That's a point. One point I wish to make to qualify your statement. What are Nehru's sources about using terms of the Hindus? All the usual sources. what he read on Indian history, you can see it in his books, is the Cambridge Histories of India, all the Orientalist literature, all the Greater India Society literature, and all the usual stuff that was published until the 1930s, when he was able to read all these books. So this is a standard usage, and he adopted it. And the reasons for him adopting it, well, I've given the reasons, and I think also my colleague Raghavan has done so. So it is very much there. And as far as the question of Greater India as deriving from the European practice of using Greater Germany and so on, yes, I think very much so. Europe was full of these pan movements, pan-Russian, pan-German, pan-God knows what, and Greater Germany was one of them. Großdeutsch was a very important part of it, and certainly the Indians would have taken it on. All Indian nationalism is very beholden to European nationalism, and especially to German nationalism and to German romantic ideas. It comes from there. So there's nothing very surprising about it. Both the vocabulary and the core ideas, all Indian nationalists, Hindu, secular, everybody, took their nationalist core beliefs or core concepts entirely from 19th century Europe, and especially from European romantic ideas, which originates in Germany. So it's not surprising at all. Yeah.
Thank you.
To the first question about the unity and whether Indianization was an Indian concept or a European concept. It was very much a European concept. It was first used by Georges Sédès, who was a French, I wouldn't say archaeologist, philologist, who looked at inscriptions, and he wrote the Indianized states of Southeast Asia. A lot of the people whom Ambassador Raghavan talked about studied in France. They adopted these terms from the French archaeologists who were writing about it. We must also remember that the archaeologists who were working in India and Southeast Asia were all Europeans at that point in time. And this notion that, this great civilization of Southeast Asia did not come from Indians, it came from Europeans. So I think we need to be very clear on that. And because the Indians were studying in France, they took that and then turned it around the way it has already been described. So thank you.
Yeah, sure. Sorry.
I just, these different, the Indian and the European perspectives on Southeast Asia and how did the Indian nationalists view it. The story doesn't stop with decolonization. It has, in fact, continued, and I couldn't touch on that because, as Professor Ray said, many of the Indians who worked on this and were part of the Greater India Society movement had studied in Dutch and French universities or in British universities. But a great break came in the late 70s and early 80s between the Indian perspectives and the European perspectives. And this was in the midst of a civil war in Cambodia when the Europeans and especially the French, the EFEO had to leave and the Indians were given custody of the Angkor Wat complex. And it was, the first time that archaeology, or at least Indian archaeology, was in the middle of this geopolitical dogfight. And this debate went on for about 10 or 15 years. And it's interesting that the Indian scholars of the Greater India Society, who had been forgotten for the past 30, 40 years, were then being reread again, because you see, in the Western perspective, India was there only because of a particular geopolitical situation, that no other country recognized Cambodia at the time. But the Indians felt we were there not just because of our ancient heritage, but also because of our past scholarship. And it was a very interesting tussle which played out all through the 80s and early 90s.
In fact, the Archaeological Survey of India used to tell me that they had a huge problem in the renovation work because, there were a lot of these various pillars and stones which were strewn all around the site. And these were numbered, but how they were to be put together was actually with the French. And when the ASI asked the French to share some of that information with them so that they could do a better job of the renovation, the French refused. They said it's better that you don't do this work, and when the conditions are better, we will come back and finish the work. Yes, please. Okay, just two last questions because we have completely run out of time. Yes.
Sir, don't you think there is a racial subtext to Indianization? Yeah. Sir, don't you
Can
think
you please identify yourself?
My name is Ashish Kumar, and I'm from Punjab University, assistant professor there. Don't you think there is a racial subtext to this entire Indianization idea? Because when I read R.C. Mazumdar's work, then it's also like a great march of the Aryans from Central Asia to India and then going to Southeast Asia, and all the conquering and establishing a new culture and such things. So
Okay, racist? Yeah.
Sorry, my name is
yeah.
Gauri Krishnan. I'm with the Prime Minister's Museum in Tinmurti. Basically, I've spent most of my museum career in Singapore. Yes. Himanshu knows me well. So my question is in the context of where do you place the influence of Tagore? Because I think Professor Palat mentioned Tagore, but I think in the greater context of the national perspective and this Tagore's idea of the Asian universalism. So how do you place that? Yeah. We've been talking a lot about the West and India.
So last two questions. Would you like to take the last one on Pan-Asianism?
You know, it's quite interesting that Tagore, when he goes to Borobudur, he says, this is not something that you like. I mean, this is all put together in a very strange way, and it's got its proportions mixed up. So Tagore was very critical of this great monument that we all admire now. And essentially, I think that at one level, he did see the similarities, but at another level, he was not sort of that taken up by Southeast Asian culture. So,
yeah.
Madhavan, would you
add something? Yeah, and the other question is
yes.
On the racist part.
On the question of racism, I just want to point out that however much they might have felt that they were superior, in whichever way they felt they were superior, it was not racist. Racism is a very specific scientific concept, if I can call it scientific, because they called it scientific, those who were racist in Europe, and they had a scientific theory, always inverted commas. So it is scientific racism, which is about a biological hierarchy and of superiority and inferiority, which Indians did not have, even if they felt superior. It was not based upon a biological hierarchy at all, and not genetical in that sense. So we can't use the term race here, however much it might have seemed very similar. And about Tagore, while Himanshu's point is, I take, the point is Tagore almost thought like Nehru about this, that India was actually disseminating its culture and creating this world, or it had, and it had revived everything. So Tagore also comes out quite nationalist in this respect. That's the only point. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think you all agree this has been a most educative session that we have had. Thanks to all our distinguished panelists for this wonderful evening. Let me just end by pointing out that I spoke about my experiences in Southeast Asian, serving in Southeast Asian countries. What I would say is that, what we can really be proud about is that I think India, in a sense, provided that spark which led to a cultural efflorescence in these countries. But you see the sounds and colors of India everywhere, but it's not Indian. It has been given a certain local genius, drawing upon this cultural inspiration from India. And I like the idea of circularity, because I think in the sort of nation state kind of frame that we have, that circularity which did not actually recognize borders, and you see this fungibility in a sense of cultures across Southeast Asia and India, which has somehow been lost sight of because of the fact that we fragment them into nation states. And perhaps there is some merit in overcoming some of these national borders to really look at that larger picture which has somehow been lost. Thank you very much, and again, thank you for a lovely evening.
Thank you so much.
Are you publishing this?